Hi, I'm Michael Carter. Directly behind me, this is work that I created as part of a performance called Out of Discord Comes the Most Beautiful Harmony that happened in 2019 at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz. I've been using the pendulum almost exclusively to make my work for about the past 6 years now. That came about through a real interest in the interests and the history of abstraction in Western art history, like a really deep dive into what those artists were interested in, what was important to them, and the kinds of conversations that they were having. And I really wanted to kind of reconnect to that and retrieve those dialogues that those early artists were having. So in this case, this big work was part of a performance. These are all created flat on the ground with the pendulum above them. We did this as a part of a performance that lasted about 40 minutes, where I created this live in front of an audience in collaboration with a sound bowl practitioner. So she would play these rhythms of sound, one kind of vibration that are happening at the same time that the pendulum is spinning, making its mark in space. All of these came out of a real interest in what these early non-representational artists were really interested in. Their interests were all in the sort of new spiritual movements that were coming into existence at the turn of the last century. The pendulum, I was really inspired by these ways that these artists were trying to think about how do you visualize the invisible. I mean, their interest was in talking about things like vibration, the way that the ideas of what we think of as sound are fundamental to the structure of the universe. And for them, they were able to visualize these in a number of ways. One of the tools that they used was this kind of Victorian parlor amusement called the harmonograph. That was a pendulum that was kind of like something that you would set up in your parlor when your friends would come over, and depending on how you adjust the weights on it, you could make different kinds of shapes or patterns with the harmonograph. I got really interested in just how you make a similar kind of technique or a similar kind of work. The harmonograph is a kind of complicated tool, so I started with the single pendulum, and that's how I created the piece right here behind me. Yeah, so this is a catalog from the Basilisk, which was an exhibition at Nicodem Gallery in 2019 that was organized by Aaron Moulton, that focused on many of these themes and also sort of how they've been evolving over the last century. So I did a performance with a lot of really great artists. There's the opening walk-in, and I did another performance there. Here is the space pre-performance with the pendulum, the same pendulum that's here in my studio now. And this is on canvas. It's about the same size as the one on the wall there. And there is the post-performance space. And then this was a second exhibition called the Hierophant that was in the Bucharest branch of Nicodem Gallery that I also had to work in. And it was really focused kind of on the individuals. The first one was Basilisk more on the ideas, and this one was sort of on the people who are doing these things in the work. There is one of my pendulum pieces with a lot of other really great artists as well. And this is actually one that I did, one of the first ones that I did with that technique. Here is a part of the apparatus that I used to make these paintings with. And this is the same vessel that I've been using to do all the performances over the last 4 or 5 years now to make these works. So this pendulum made the painting that's behind it right now. And this one is really simple. I literally just cut a hole in the tip of it. And this gets filled with paint and put it into motion. For me, the thing that's really interesting about working with the pendulum is that I'm a part of it. My hand is in there as an artist, but at a certain point, I step out of it and I kind of let it go and let it do its own thing. So I start it and then I decide when it stops. And then it's gravity that takes over and does the rest of the piece. But the thing that's really interesting about it to me is that the pieces are never the same. It's impossible to recreate the same exact type. So there's always this kind of connection to the moment, the energy of the space, my psychology at the moment, all these other aspects of it. And somehow those seem to all kind of end up in the spaces. I've really noticed that there's a big difference, what is my relationship with the venue, what is my relationship with the people who are hosting the show, and somehow all of that energy ends up in the pendulum result at the end as well. gravity is interesting to me because it's this thing that we all accept. It's an idea, we learn about it in like physics class or in science class, but there's actually still a lot of questions about like what it is and really how it works. Scientists have like proposed that there's like a particle called the graviton, but no one's actually ever found it. The idea of what gravity is evolving. In some ways it doesn't really exist. But I like that idea that like the painting is kind of a relationship, or the process is a relationship with something that's bigger than me and that affects all of us. I'm for a moment engaged in a relationship with something that's suprapersonal, that's transpersonal, that's bigger than me, but it's the same thing that keeps my feet on the ground. It's the same thing that makes their skin drag when they get older. We all have a relationship with that force. And so I like the metaphor of that a lot. So this is Thought Forms. This book was first published in 1901. It's probably one of the first theories of abstract art in English that was ever written. And the idea behind the book is that it's kind of like a second generation Theosophical Society product. Here's this, my copy came from the library of the Theosophical Society in Pasadena. And the idea behind the book is that if someone had developed spiritual qualities and they were clairvoyant, that they could objectively see the forms of thoughts and emotions. And so this whole book is kind of like a taxonomy. It's a discussion of what that looks like and what those would be. So it starts off with the whole section of relating colors to different kinds of psychological or spiritual states. Blue being spiritual, like red being like anger or emotion, yellow being kind of intellectual quality, green, they call it adaptability here. This book comes out 1901. It's like, things like the electromagnetic spectrum is just being discovered, radiation is just being discovered, and those kinds of things. And so they're very focused on ideas that we would now call New Age, ideas like a vibration or energy or the aura. And so they basically kind of like lay out this way of how do we make this argument. So I was talking about the harmonograph before. Here's some outputs for the harmonograph. And this is really what inspired me to start working with the Pendulum, was this book. So this is the same book. If you had gone back a century and you had talked to the artists who were the kind of avant-garde artists who were first doing non-representational art or making abstract art, this is what they were talking about. And they were either involved with or members of the Theosophical Society. So Hilma of Klint, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Agnes Pelton, there's all of them, like to a fault. And then inside, it's like it becomes more and more complicated. They connect the idea of shape, different kinds of emotion. So this is like a feeling of affection, like radiating affection for someone you like. But this one that's a little darker and kind of has this claw shape, that's like desire combined with affection, like you want something from somebody. And it just gets more and more complex in the book. And then this is like a really famous image you see around a lot. And the idea is this is like, what is the thought form? What is the vibration that's created by a choir singing like a Mendelssohn Sunday at church? And this is like the music, the shape that the music and the emotion and the spiritual feeling makes if you can perceive this on as a clairvoyant, the kind of astral form. This catalog here is from an exhibition that happened at LACMA way back in the 80s. And it's still probably one of the most important exhibitions to come out about this sort of connection between the spiritual interests of these avant-garde artists and their artwork. And one of the things that the curator Maurice Tuchman did with this exhibition is he paired the text, the books, like thought forms, with the artwork. And he was like, I think, the first person to really do that. So here's thought forms again, right? Here's the plate. This is an image of sudden fright. And then in the spiritual art catalog, that's the very first plate in here. So this was like, he was trying to make this connection because for like a good 40 or 50 years, this relationship was totally suppressed and denied in academia. So if you went and studied art history at, Columbia, the idea that these artists had spiritual interests was totally like laughed at. They were like, oh, that's ridiculous. We can't even talk about that. And so he was really like, this is, his mentor at the time was really emphasize these things. So this catalog is great. You can still kind of find it around. And I recommend anyone who wants to know more about this history to find a copy of it. This show is also really important now to us because this was also the first exhibition where the artwork of Hilma af Klint was shown after her death. And that's a detail that many people don't know about. But it was here in Los Angeles where they first showed her work after the moratorium that she placed that her work not be shown for 50 years after her death. And this exhibition that came out of it later on. So, right, the Hilma show, if you go back to thought forms again, this plate is very common, the kind of like spiritual or psychological connection to colors. And these kinds of things are completely... Hilma probably had a copy of this book, or she was at least familiar with it at the time. And so if you go into the book, lots of the discussions in the back especially. So like this, for instance, this is a plate from a book called Man, Visible, Invisible, or Man, Visible and Invisible. The text was all about the aura and what does the aura look like and what are the qualities and characteristics when someone can perceive an aura. And so literally, if you talk to any person today who will tell you anything about like what an aura is or what the different colors and meaning of the auras, ultimately it all came from this book, if you go back. So this is another really important text, and this of course is really influential to the work that I'm doing now. Let's go a little bit deeper into the Spiritual Art exhibition. And so it's a really great overview of the history up to the recent times for these kinds of artworks. So there were so many artists who were really involved in these, who had these sort of spiritual interests and were studying these different kinds of spiritual doctrines and concepts. Mondrian is a really great example of this. So there's a whole section here on the Dutch artists of that era, is an early Mondrian work. But before he started doing these fully abstract ones, and Mondrian was a real student of Theosophy. He studied the texts and writings of one of the main founders of the Theosophical Society, which is Helena Blavatsky, and her kind of most important text called The Secret Doctrine. And so before he started doing this kind of work, that maybe he's more better known for today, he was also doing work like this. So he's thinking about ideas of matter and spirit and the kind of conjunction of those things. Like, how do you make a full person? You have to understand your physical, your animal qualities, but you also need to reach for your spiritual qualities. And then this exhibition was really important because it was the first time that the artwork of Hilma af Klint was shown. And this is probably one of the first academic essays about her work that was put in publication. This is like in the 80s, right? Like think about a recent exhibition at the Guggenheim that happened 2019. And we're just now talking about this, but almost 30 years ago. Malevich, right, is another example of an artist who was really interested and involved in these conversations. It turns out that if you really start to look at this, early 20th century abstraction, almost to a fault, all of these artists are interested in these new spiritual movements that are arising at their time. More thought forms. Another really interesting artist who is connected to these ideas, of course, is folks like Duchamp, whose interest more was about alchemy and kind of like the Western esoteric tradition, but still is very connected to that. This is really interesting because this work of Duchamp's, these kind of rotating mandala-like pieces, the first time this work here, the sort of well-known altarpiece by Hilma af Klint was shown, it was actually paired with this work. This was like the exhibition that it's the curation that they put these two works together. So as part of my interest in using the pendulum as an art device, I've also been learning to use the pendulum in dowsing, right? So like, how do you make the pendulum respond to other questions, or how do you use it as a sensitive instrument? There's always this kind of idea where people say, oh, the pendulum, it isn't moving on its own, I'm moving it, right? But that's the whole idea. Like the pendulum is like an instrument for sensing, whether that's a vibration or a quality or an energy. The pendulum can be used in all kinds of ways. And it's an intuitive device for accessing things in the subconscious that we not necessarily can think of with our rational mind. So around 2019, I really became interested in ways to diversify how the pendulum was being used, to think of it more as a tool and not necessarily just a formal way of painting. I've been moving through this process where now I'm integrating the figure. I'm thinking more about the pendulum as a way to visualize energy, a way to visualize a feeling of vibration from a person, and the way that it can almost be used as a camera or as like an aura camera, for instance, to show the sort of personal quality. One of the things that's really interesting about the pendulum is that it's always unique. I can't recreate the same work. There's always something different about it. And so it becomes like a portrait of a person or a situation or a place. About 2 years ago, I started directly integrating the figure and thinking about these as kind of diagrams. So again, like the work of Hilma of Klint and her use of the diagram to explain abstract or esoteric spiritual concepts, I started exploring the same ideas on my own. In our culture now, we're really fixated on identity, our subjective experience. The conversations about race and gender are very central to all of our dialogues. I think one of the things about the spiritual conversation is it's always saying, yes, that's what we experience, but is there something more? Can we think about ourselves in another way, in a larger way, in a deeper way? And so how can I use the techniques that I'm developing here to also think about those things? So I started really looking a lot about how the body has been used historically, whether it's an Egyptian image of the Nut, the sky goddess, whether it's a tantric image of the chakras, whether it's a Christian astrological image, or more of a kind of androgynous alien being that we might associate with the contemporary New Age. What I'm always trying to do is just like, how do we get outside of our individual perspective? Is there something beyond our subjectivity? And how maybe I can make you think about those things in my work.